think Bill Moran doesn't need a big introduction, but he's done a couple things that I think are worth noting. First, I can attest to this, I can actually stipulate to this in legal terms, that we spent about 10 years arguing over gapped billets at sea. And it wasn't pretty. We had enough people in our Navy to man the ships and squadrons that we had, but we couldn't seem to get them on the ships. And Bill Moran, who's been Chief of Naval Personnel since August of 2013, he finally came in and said, put the people on the ships and into the squadrons. And it's been a remarkable result. So for that, he has my undying appreciation and loyalty, and we're very pleased to have him here today as the Chief of Naval Personnel to talk about manpower, personnel, training, and future for the Navy. And I'll turn it over to Admiral Moran.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Peter. Great to be here, and a real privilege to finally have an opportunity to speak at CSIS. I'm normally sitting in that audience right there and anxious to hear what other people have to say. It's a little different when you're the one delivering a remark, so I'll try to do one thing, and that is to stop talking before you stop listening. So there's a lot of ground to cover, and my intent through a series of slides is to kind of lay out the context for this discussion about people, and then get to your questions and try to have a dialogue, because we could go, as my staff will tell you, I could spend hours up here and just keep on going, because I'm very passionate about the people business. And what's interesting to me is all of the conversation and dialogue that is occurring around this town about people and what is commonly referred to as talent, and this whole notion of talent management. What is it? And if you go down to the Millington office, where all of our detailers and placement officers, community managers on the officer enlisted side exist, they go, we do talent management all the time. It's what we've always done. That is the job of moving talent around. So I'm going to try to give you a little insight into what we believe talent management means to the change in the dialogue and where we're trying to take the Navy. And then happy to talk about a lot of things that are referenced in major efforts that have been underway for several months, to include Force of the Future being run out of OSD, which we are active participants in, but also what our own Secretary of the Navy has challenged us with doing. And there are several initiatives that we've had underway for over a year now. They're starting to now blossom into actual policy and execution, and I'm happy to talk about any of those. I really wanted to start, though, to tell you that I'm not a personnelist by trade, and probably no one more surprised to be asked to come to this job than me when I got that phone call. Yeah, but at the end of the day, it works pretty well when you come at things with a different viewpoint. And I've got a fabulous team in Millington, a great team down in Pensacola, up at Great Lakes, where we bring in 36,000 sailors every year. They do marvelous work. So I thought when I entered the job, my first few months, I better go do what all people who are not experts in the field do, and is to get out and talk to people and listen to them and try to learn what's on their minds. Because I've frankly been in the Pentagon and N98 and Director of Air Warfare for 3 years, and spent a lot of time on programming things, but not really too concerned about the people side. And any leader in the fleet will tell you that it's all about the people, but we rarely pay attention to the weapon system that supports people. So I needed to go out and listen and find out what was on people's minds. I'd heard some things, like Admiral Daly talked about, with respect to manning in the fleet. Frankly, I didn't truly have a full appreciation for what that was and the impact on sailors' lives, commanding officers' lives. So my fleet master chief and I went and pretty much did a lap around the world in about 3 months and talked to what felt like all 326,000 sailors in the Navy. And it was very, very insightful for me. I found out that senior officers were far more concerned about the manning levels and began to really turn their focus to, are they well trained and the right fit for the billets in the fleet. My predecessor, frankly, put in motion buying back a lot of people that we had gone too deep. So I was the beneficiary of seeing a lot of young men and women coming in at kind of a surge, an extra 6,000 a year over 2 years that started to come out of Great Lakes and populate the fleet. The problem was that there were what we call pack sailors or GenDets. They were not trained in a skill set. They did not have a rate, and they showed up at the fleet. And while the fleet was happy to have that body in a billet, we weren't giving them what they really needed, which was the best trained and fit sailor for that. Bless you. What I heard from juniors, though, junior sailors, both officer and enlisted, was a much different story. What I heard from them was frustration with deployment lengths. So remember 2.5 years ago, we were in the midst of back-to-back turns on Stennis, back-to-back turns on Eisenhower, extended deployments for Nimitz. These were multiple efforts on the operational front for all the right reasons in terms of national security. But they were frustrating to sailors at many levels, but especially the commanding officer and below, when it came to having some stability in their lives, especially at home, being able to tell their spouses, their families, in a predictable way what the future held in terms of time at home. We heard a lot of discussions from fleet sailors about manning. They were still frustrated with the fact that, hey, great, you filled this job next to me, but I'm training, I have to spend all my time training this kid. They're not coming to me with training. So frustration on manning. Frustrations on advancement cycles. In the enlisted force, we had peaks and valleys. The pitch and amplitude of tracking mechanisms were pretty unsettling when you look at it for the first time and see some rates with 100% opportunity to advance multiple times, multiple sessions, and then other rates where you had 0% opportunity to advance depending on the pay grade. And so that was another thing you log in the back of your head as you're talking to sailors. And we also saw a lot of frustration on the maintenance front. You've heard Admiral Greenert, now Admiral Richardson, Admiral Davidson, before him Admiral Gortney, talking a lot about how we have to stabilize our shipyards, our depots, so that we can get on a schedule that is predictable for the fleet. Maintenance is kind of the centerpiece of that because we had put off maintenance for a lot of our ships, put off modernization efforts so that we could deploy and be forward. So we had to make a concerted effort to go in after maintenance as well. So at the end of the day, after talking to tens of thousands of sailors and of all different ranks and pay grades, I came back saying we're just out of balance as a Navy. We're chasing our tail in ways that affect our people, and that effect on our people could affect their decision to stay. And if we start losing people because they're frustrated and don't have a sense of balance and stability in their lives, we're going to run into problems. And all of us who've been around long enough have seen these problems in the past. And so you come back and you start asking questions. As an absolute novice in the business, not really knowing what to ask or how to ask it, just using what I hope came across as common sense to the staff, was just show me some data. Show me what this means, what are we doing about it? And it was remarkable to find out that we couldn't get our arms around the data we had. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I decided to start taking the approach that I learned in N98 on programming to try to force some discussions. And whenever you go after money, you go after people's strongly held beliefs in this town. So we went after the money and tried to align things. It just so happened at the same time we were getting back from these visits and starting to ask the questions, I was being pulled into the discussion of the Retirement Commission, which was looking at a series of things and recommendations to make to Congress, the White House, and OSD eventually. Fundamental to the biggest change in there, of course, was the proposal to change our retirement system. And if you want to talk about a pillar of how we recruit, retain, and maintain careers, one of them, of course, is DAMA for officers. Another one is Goldwood or Nichols, and another one is the retirement system. And yet we were talking about the retirement system in a vacuum. And it was a costing effort, but also a recognition that we were the only large corporation in America that was on a defined benefit program only. And shouldn't we start to drift towards where the rest of America is going, the rest of the world is going, and frankly, where our Navy civilian workforce already was. And of course, a lot of strongly held beliefs about don't touch that system. It's worked for us well for a very long time, multiple decades. So when you take the feedback about out of balance, unstable existence, and introducing a discussion about fundamentally changing a retirement. And back then, as you know, we didn't know whether we were going to have a grandfather clause. We didn't know what it really meant. And all of our assumptions and models about how to take care of people were based on a retirement system like the one I'm on and the one everybody in uniform here is on. So if we're going to change it, we have to really challenge the assumptions by which we manage our workforce. And we weren't doing it. And when we tried to pull data, we couldn't pull the data quickly and have good analytics behind it. We would literally have to hire somebody to do it. And again, I'll get to that here in a minute. In the backdrop, if you listen to the corporate America and big business, there was this idea that we don't have enough highly skilled talent in the workforce coming out of high school and college to populate the growing exponential growth in high-tech industry around the country. And as I heard echoes of that in industry and talking to people out in corporate America, I started thinking, man, that's exactly who we're going after in a more and more high-tech, complex Navy. So alarm bells start going off, little rings in your head go off about what's going on. And my team would come into the office and say, hey, sir, we're meeting every month, every goal in recruiting there is. We've got great retention. We're hitting all our marks in zone A, B, and C. Life is good. Navy's doing great. Why are you talking about change? And that was the first sign. That was the real loud sign. The signal-to-noise ratio went way up on that one. I said, now I know we got problems because we think everything's running great. And I would challenge, and I challenged myself to think about what it was like in the late 90s. When as a CO, I was graded on who and how many I could keep in the Navy. So if we were graded on that, do you think when you came across a young man or woman who you thought, you're just not built for the Navy, it's a good time to go find some other work? Our incentive was just the opposite, because we were having a hell of a time retaining people in the Navy. And we weren't hitting our recruiting goals, and you get the sense. So when you ask the workforce, hey, what's changed from the late 90s to today that makes it so good? Not a really good answer. Policies were the same. Processes were identical. Assumptions and models were identical. So I want to talk a little bit about what the data is showing us as kind of the why we are spending time talking about and doing things to change the way we do personnel. If you go to the next slide, I don't think I've got control here. At least no one gave me a clicker. This is a great picture, recent picture in the fleet. What's striking about this is on the right-hand side is you've got really profound digital capability that is transforming the way we man ships. And certainly this is very similar to what you see in the aircraft, submarine, IDC communities throughout the Navy. But on the left is you got this wonderfully motivated, talented young sailor on a set of sound-powered phones. Vintage 19, I don't know, Pete, you could tell me. How far back does that go? This is, in my view, this is kind of what could be in Navy personnel and what is in Navy personnel. We have the ability to go to the right side of the screen, but we're an analog organization in every respect. We're manpower intensive. Every time we take cuts, we got to take it in detailers and placement officers and those sorts of things. So the human interfaces and the human touch points are going down over time, and we're not doing anything to modernize to the right side of this picture. There was no money really being invested in the backbone of our industry, if you will, to give us better information, give it so that we can make smarter decisions and forecast and predict troubles that are ahead of us. And then if you want to work the workforce in a different way, actually move people around by knowing exactly what their strengths and weaknesses are, as opposed to just the needs of the Navy. We've got to go to the right side and get off the sound-powered phones. So that's, in essence, what, after all that learning and conversation out in the fleet, you come back and you say, we just aren't modernizing our weapons system in Navy personnel. Then Admiral Greenert, the CNO, was a staunch advocate for investing in things we should be doing just in this business world. And so we went out, set out on a path. Next slide. So this slide is, we put this together just yesterday, kind of rolled up a few things together. Everybody's heard about the cost for people. The red line is a very conservative assessment analysis, does not include healthcare, of just the cost for our military people on the MPN side. Doesn't even include the civilians. And you can see that trajectory is pretty steep. You base that against, or contrast it against the green dotted line, which is the quality of the people that are coming into the Navy. And you could argue that the increases in our pay and compensation have increased the quality of our people that come in. Or you could argue something else, which I'll get to in a minute. The blue line, though, is a representation of the seniority of the force. The ratio of senior staff versus junior warfighter is going in the wrong direction. And of course, the blue shaded area is a representation of our total end strength over the last 30, 40 years. We're half the size of what we were at the end of the 80s in total end strength. So our TOA, just in the last 10 years, 15 years, has nearly doubled. Our force in terms of end strength has come down anywhere from 60,000 in the active to 90,000 total active and reserve. And the amount of money we spend on people is still full 1/3 of our budget. That's an unsustainable model over time. So in the process of addressing just how you bring in the great talent and retain it, you also got to talk about cost. Otherwise, we're going to run out of money to modernize, to recapitalize, and to be able to operate at levels that we're comfortable with. Next slide. This is, to me, one of the most important topics to talk about. The green line represents the ratio of, in American society, of veterans in the U.S. Veterans, just in the last 10 years, have declined by almost 8 million people. They are where we get our talent from. So greater than 85% of the young men and women who join the Navy come from what we call military bloodlines across the services, and absolutely true in the Navy. I'll tell you a little story. Last week, or the day before Thanksgiving, I was over at the Ceremonial Guard headquarters in Anacostia. We've got 220 terrific young men and women who are hand-selected out of boot camp to be in that Ceremonial Guard for 2 years. I asked them at one point in the Q&A, I said, so how many of you, just raise your hand, how many of you are sons or daughters of parents who are on active duty or have served on active duty? 80% of the hands went up. Now, we should all ask ourselves a strategic question. Is that a healthy place to be for a workforce that is, over time, becoming more and more of a closed-loop system? Do we have diversity of thought? Do we have diversity of background, experience, ideas, innovation? I don't know. What I do know is we got great young men and women in the Navy today. But if the pool from which we pull young men and women is in decline, and we're going to stay at a level end strength, there's no question it's going to get harder and harder to pull and attract that same talented pool into the Navy. So this is one we can't ignore. Next slide. Every model we run on retaining great people in the Navy is based on unemployment. The purple line there is the unemployment rate since what is that, 1992? That's as far back as we officially tracked unemployment. And you can see it's kind of a leading indicator to what retention, this is zone A retention, which is when you think about 50 to 60% of our sailors leave at the end of their first contract. It's a pretty good metric to follow. But the overall trend has been up, but it also shows you where as unemployment goes up, retention goes up, and when unemployment goes down, i.e. a good, strong economy or a stronger economy, retention goes down. What's got me worried on this thing is that model is being challenged here right now. And look at the far right of that slide, and you see that the lines have merged and are actually going to start going in the other direction based on forecast. So the unemployment rate's still coming down, and our retention's still going up. Why is that? Well, I hear from economists all the time that, well, the unemployment rate is really not a measure because our labor participation rate is down significantly and yada, 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 yada. Well, that's kind of been the case on and off for years. So we do have to ask ourselves and challenge our assumptions. Are we measuring the right thing as a predictor for what we will see coming in the future? I don't know the answer to that. All I know is that's what we've used in the past. The other reason I'm concerned is on the right side of that chart, at the top of that orange curve could be me looking over a cliff. And it's just a matter of weeks, days, months, or years that our retention rate falls precipitously, which it's done in the past, if you look along that chart. When I think about my time as a junior officer and in my time as a commanding officer, we had some serious challenges on this side. We can't afford to have a precipitous drop. We can afford to have a gradual drop because we can recover from that through some tools. But a precipitous drop is really hard to turn around in a reasonable amount of time. So those three slides kind of hopefully tell you why I am so concerned. In spite of the fact that we have great retention, great recruiting, great performance in the fleet across the board, there's reason to go, what's the future going to be? And are we positioned, are we postured to deal with an economy that does begin to turn around in a stronger fashion than it currently is? Anxious to hear from you on that. Next slide. So we're on a new approach, and that new approach is quite frankly to deal with the off-balance, unstable condition that we found ourselves in just 2-3 short years ago. We've turned that back around through a lot of good ideas from young sailors and great support from senior leaders, and a whole series of initiatives that we've undertaken. And we're beginning to invest in modernizing that weapon system so that we can understand who we're bringing in to a greater degree, understand what their talents are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and properly put them in the right ratings, not just based on hearsay and what they're hearing from their buddies in the fleet, but based on what characteristics and qualities they bring to the table. We are clearly going down a path on the training side to bring in mobile, modular training, get away from the traditional industrial model of training on a conveyor belt, which is if you go to Great Lakes, you will see that conveyor belt moving every day, no matter what quality you bring to the table. Now, it is a necessary part of sailorization that goes along with Great Lakes, and we always want to keep that capability. But if you ever go up there for graduation and you sit down the night before, they call it pizza night, you have pizza with these young men and women who are just so motivated to get to the fleet. And then we say, well, you're going to be a fire controlman. We'll get you to the fleet in about 2.5 years, because that's how long it takes to get through the pipe on average. And there's several rates like that. Or you're a pack sailor who came in the Navy because you wanted to get in the Navy right away and you didn't want to go into the delayed entry pool. But you don't have a rate, and we're just going to throw you into a ship or a squadron or shore duty. And then you got a couple years to figure out what you want to do in life. All of those things work against us. They're counterproductive, and they are far too inefficient. So we bring in 36,000 sailors at the bottom, just the enlisted force, to get to a much smaller number at the end of 5 or 6 years. That model is industrial strength. We could do so much better if we could track individual skill sets, like I said, qualities, and those sorts of things. So we're on that path through a series of policy changes, but most importantly, to be able to, I wanted to come back to this notion of data. Over time, rather than modernizing our system, we've put Band-Aids in functionality out there to deal with things that we saw were wrong. All good efforts, many of them paying off. But inside those functions, were built separate databases to deal just with that function. Today, we've got at least 57 databases supporting functions that exceed 100 total that do not necessarily talk and share data and information. There is corrupt data. And what I mean by that is I could be Bill, or I could be William, or I could be William Francis in different databases, and they may not recognize me. And so we're challenged by how we take advantage of all that data that's out there and to turn it into better decision-making tools, not just for me, but imagine if you could do this and kick it all the way down to commanding officers, which is really where you want those local decisions being made about the quality of people we're trying to keep. And then the policies that we're working on are all designed and focused through the lens of giving local commanding officers more authority to make decisions and a better conversation to have with their young men and women and wrestle control from the big bureaucracy that we are today. Next slide. So I'll just close this off so we can get into a dialogue and get to your questions with, at the end of the day, the CNO, many of you may have heard him recently. He's started a really good conversation about our design for maritime superiority. And it talks a lot about capability, it talks a lot about presence, it talks a lot about partners. But underneath all of that, and central to it, is this notion that we have to have a strong team. We got to populate the Navy with strong players and keep that team strong. And then when you get into any range of conflict, that strong, innovative team can respond in ways that we all know we're capable of doing, if we can keep it. And that's my goal. Over to you. Who's got the first question?
Okay, well, Bill, have a seat. If it's okay.
I can't sit down, you know that.
Oh, come on, sit down. So we're going to do a couple icebreaker questions, and then I'll go to the audience. But Bill, first question, just to break the ice, was, you've obviously been on station since August of 13. You saw early on you needed to do something with the industrial draft-based personnel system that you inherited and that we still have in place. Published a great article back in December last year. And then this year, Brad Carson comes on the scene, Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, and he starts that Force of the Future piece. And it's got a lot of elements in it. It's got new pay tables, repeal up or out, flexible joint requirements, career intermissions, more civilian schools. How is what you're doing and have been doing work with that? Are you together? Is that complementary?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the last year has been an amazing year to be in personnel because so many people are taking a great interest and probably seeing some similar trends to what I'm seeing across the force. And they have the same concerns. How are we going to be able to maintain the high quality force that we have across every service? And how are we going to shape that force to the right skill sets that we need in the future? And so OSD with Brad Carson's leadership really in similar ways, but even in bigger ways, started to challenge a lot of our assumptions and a lot of the processes, the big ones like DAMA reform and Goldwater Nichols and certainly the military retirement system. And he opened up a dialogue that I was was ready to have. I mean, you can do so much within your own service inside a policy. And we've got a lot of authority inside of the policy, inside of Secretary authority to do things, to change things. But we run up against, at some point, we're going to run up against the law for good reason and maybe old reasons. And so I was hopeful that we would be able to begin to have that discussion and debate with all the services in the room. And so he started the working groups late last spring and ran all the way through the summer at a very high pace, high octane discussion with all of us. At the same time, SecNav was challenging us with a series of innovative ideas and policy changes to try to address what we all saw as potential retention problems, and going after rich talent pools like the female population, which is relatively untapped when you think about it over time. And so we had to do some things. So he's helped on that regard, showing the leadership and giving direction. Sino Greenert, now Sino Richardson, are embracing a lot of those ideas. So it was very complementary to what OSD was doing in Force of the Future. I'd say the fundamental difference was that we all recognize that those big rocks, statutory reform, are something that we can't control, nor OSD can control. We can only recommend, and then the Hill ultimately has to decide whether the law can be changed. So the debate had not, or the discussion had not moved to Congress. But if you watch with all the hearings that are going on right now on personnel, DAMA, and now Goldwater Nichols, they are entering into this discussion because I think Force of the Future became a forcing function, if I could be that cute. So I like where we are right now. I know there are people that had an expectation that this was going to be transformational in nature, and I would argue that it is, in the sense that we've opened up the dialogue that we haven't had in a very long time. And it's got some momentum, it's got movement, and I'm encouraged by all of that, and we're participating at every level. We kind of wrapped up the Force of the Future discussion. We just wrapped up a DAMA reform. I would call it not so much a reform, but an adjustment, an enhancement to DAMA that we think we could use as services. And the next follow-on one, as I think it was announced this morning by Secretary Carter, we're going to start the working group on Goldwater Nichols reform. Because clearly we're all going to have to testify to these in the spring as Congress starts to set in motion this further discussion. So to answer your question, we are absolutely complementary in our intent. We debate and we discuss the differences in our approach. You know, I think you have to fully recognize that the Army over the last 3 or 4 years is in a much different place than the Navy in terms of retention. They've been on a path to reduce the size of their force in a very significant way, where I'm trying to increase the size of the Navy at the same time. So our needs, our policy discretion is much different right now. And it may flip on itself in 5 or 10 years. So I think once we all recognize that we were after the same thing, getting great people, keeping great people, and every service is built different. They have different requirements, different skill sets, and we're in a different place in time in terms of force shaping. Once we got past all that, we all started to really have good, rich discussions about getting what I would describe as discretionary authorities put into statute that we could pull off the shelf when we needed it at the time of our greatest need. So that's
good. Some of these, as you've just alluded, depend heavily on authorities and some changes in the law. Mm-hmm. Others, not so much. And it strikes me that some of those things that the SecNav rolled out in the spring were good and largely fit these categories, but the scale was small. When do you think, based on your looking at all this, when do you think we'll be able to get at some of these big ticket items at a large scale?
Well, I think that's going to happen in the next year through a lot of discussion with the Hill, testimony. I think we will eventually have to stand up some type of formal effort to both enter into a more formal dialogue with the Hill to actually put proposals forward that are in writing. So there are some legislative change proposals that we have agreed to in the DAMA reform. At least the Navy has agreed with the working group recommendations. In fact, this afternoon I'm going to the tank to have this discussion at the op steps to formally say we are ready to move forward with some legislative changes to DAMA. So these are steps in that direction. I think some people preferred, hey, let's just reform DAMA. Let's take a big step forward. I think you got to be really careful with all of the unknowns that are out there, like the change in the retirement system, which kicks off on 1 January 2018. That's not insignificant. And as much as we've modeled this and we've tried to game it, war game it, there are a lot of unknowns. So I think the last thing you want to do is make major changes to a law that has served us well, but is clearly in need of an upgrade on its own. Let's go after those upgrades with a view and reconciliation with what this new retirement system might do and how we can best plug those policies together with the retirement reform. So that, I think, within this year is going to be a very active debate and discussion on both those topics.
Final question for me, then we'll open it up, is, and you alluded to this, was the brick and mortar schoolhouse and how long it takes. New CNO has talked a couple times about accelerating learning. And could you give us a few examples? I know you don't want to get too far ahead, but how this might work. I mean, we all understand that doing very expensive, very lengthy, permanent change of station moves has been the way of doing business. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a few insights of what the future holds for accelerated learning?
Yeah, the program that the vision that we've put together just inside N1 is called Sailor 2025. And in essence, what it means is in 2025, we want to look like this as an organization in N1 that is able to deliver the following things. And one of them is we need to be more efficient in our training pipelines for the reasons you stated and the ones I stated earlier. So there's 3 pillars underneath this vision of Sailor 2025. One is modernizing the system, which includes policies and information technology that support data mining, data analysis, predictive analysis, those sorts of things. The centerpiece, though, is what we call ready relevant learning, which is to try to deliver the training at the right time, the right sailor for the right job, as opposed to this industrial model, which is put as many through as you can, make them available to the fleet, but we may be overmanned or undermanned in different sectors, and so there's a lot of inefficiency in that. Plus, the schools themselves have until recently haven't been modernized at all. We've got kids working on valves that were built in the 1940s and 50s. We've got electronic schemes that are, basic transformer, rectifier. English major here, I got to be careful. But basic electronics at that level, as opposed to what am I going to be working on in the fleet? I mean, if you can't keep them motivated about what ship class they're going to, what technology is on that ship, all those sorts of things, we need to do a better job of that. So there's incredible technology expansion and growth going on in the commercial industry. In fact, I was in Orlando last week for the ITSEC conference, where vendors that are modernizing and dreaming up and producing new training capabilities are eye-watering. And I was one of the speakers there, and I said, I just want that, I want that, I want that. It's like going in a candy store. There's so much good stuff, and you can imagine where that could take you. But it's going to take time. The good news is our resource sponsors in aviation, surface, submarine, and IDC, healthcare, they're all moving towards those technologies so that they can better, more quickly learn the information, be trained on that information, and then complement that with the other key component of learning, which is experience.
Got it.
So you got to train more effectively and arguably faster so that it matches their experiences as they enter the fleet, and then provide it at the right time so that they're truly learning. We're out of sequence in those two things, so that's the effort there. And then the third category is enriching our Navy culture, which is frankly to a lot of hard work over the last 5 years or so on getting rid of the things that we don't find appealing to everybody in our Navy from a cultural standpoint, and enriching the ones we really like empowering COs in the fleet so that they can conduct disaggregated ops when we know that all that information, that lovely information that we build today on many different dashboards, is not going to be there when you need it the most. So how are you going to lead in that environment? How are you going to survive in that environment? So those are the 3 pillars of Sailor 2025. Learning, training is central to that.
Thank you. It's going to open it up to questions, and we'll pass around microphones. I just ask that you identify yourselves. Right here. Go ahead.
I'm Megan Myers from Navy Times. My question is, which changes specifically are you looking to ask to change DAMA?
So the ones that are currently, there's a little risk to announcing what we're going to make a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense on right here. But I would describe it as giving the service secretaries the discretionary authority to implement changes to how we do up or out promotions. A good example of that is at the 04 level in all the services, you basically get 2 looks, and then you're out. In my view, it's the most important board we do on a statutory basis for our officer communities, because it culls the herd, it thins the herd very early, and you may be missing people that have been subject to timing that they couldn't control, couldn't hit milestones, maybe didn't get the right quals, and then couldn't compete and find themselves behind the power curve. So, bless you, we are working several of those legislative changes to allow the service secretaries to allow the service to implement changes into how we monitor that. So, for example, not having limits on the number of looks for 04s up until a certain point. We do that with 05s. It's called high-year tenure. We do it for 06s, high-year tenure. We all have a high-year tenure at some point, but 04s do not. And so I want to make sure we're giving every possible look at the talent at that level to make sure we're keeping the best. And we have had trouble doing that in years past. And all, again, this is a minor discretionary authority that allows us to deal with those situations or many more like that.
Are you taking any steps to get rid of officer year groups in that discussion?
Well, that fundamentally is a way around the year group discussion in many cases.
Okay, Mitzi.
Hi, Mitzi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm sorry I was a few minutes late. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I have a suggestion for you to consider. I could sell the most complex things IBM offered, but when I turned to Apple, I'm always in the Apple store getting genius help. So about 4 months ago, I had, I think, a 45-year-old African American. He had some white in his beard. And I said, how did you learn this? He said, the first thing we're taught when we come to Apple is, if you don't know, ask, we all learn together. And I thought, my God, that's exactly what the Defense Department ought to do. Now, when I came to the Navy, I would sit in all these fancy meetings, and you never got to ask a question because it was the 4, the 3, the 2. I think that mantra, Apple is the most successful corporation in the world. I don't believe that requires congressional approval, and I think it would transform the whole military. So I'm proposing this to you. You're going to have to advertise it. You ought to put up a sign in every office, in every dormitory. If you don't know, ask. It's extraordinary. In fact, the last...
Mitzi, we need to ask a question.
How are you going to do that?
Thank you.
Put up a sign in every work center that says no. Mitzi, I think more important than the signs are the actions you take. So I think...
They need permission.
Yeah, absolutely. And if at the beginning, maybe before you walked in, I talked about how I went out to listen to lots of levels in the fleet to try to learn from them. Let them ask the questions. I had no idea how fruitful that would be in terms of great ideas that were coming from our junior officers, from our junior sailors. But at the end of the day, if all you do is listen and don't act on some of these things, you're not ever going to get to the point you want to be. So we have acted on a lot of their ideas to address their concerns, but always with the premise that the things we're going to do to try to retain great talent has to start with, it has to be great talent, good above average talent that's applying for those things. That will inspire competition, that will inspire a greater level and degree of the young men and women we want to keep in the Navy. So I'm encouraged by the dialogue.
They learn from each other.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And they're not afraid to ask hard questions. None of them are afraid to ask hard questions. I think CNO probably got a little bit of that on his round the world trip. Mick Plon and I share notes all the time. He's very active in engaging sailors at every level. So I think we're doing it. But I get your point about the cultural shift can be more widely advertised and promoted. So I got that.
I think
Thanks.
Mitzi has a good point, though, about, you know, you said we got to attract these people and we got to have the right material at the start. Yeah. But I think that people stay in an organization because they feel they make a difference, yeah. Because they feel that that dialogue continues. And I do think, you know, we experience this sometimes with inputs to proceedings, that there's clearly a need for a signal that you have top cover to walk through that door, and comment and partake in that dialogue. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it, you know, just based on some trends over the past few years in careerism and political correctness, for lack of a better term, I think that there's always been a little bit of pressure not to write, not to byline an article for attribution. But I think that's in need of another pump, because some of that top cover people don't feel is there as much as it used to be. So it's, I think for all the reasons that you said, and it's embedded in Mitzi's question, is the need for that. And I know you're a believer in that, but the folks that you're trying to retain, as you get to the other end of that curve, it's important to them. So yeah, sorry for that commercial. Yeah, but out here, Roger Miso.
Admiral, good morning. Thanks for your leadership on these issues and for pushing forward good change. But with good change comes a lot of work for people, and that work translates into a high workload for detailers and sailors in Millington. Mm-hmm. So it's 2015, and my question is, why is Navy Personnel Command still in the middle of Tennessee where nothing else is? You could probably save a lot of money over the long term through volunteer talent by moving Navy Personnel Command, as I think it should be, to a major fleet concentration area, or even to Washington, D.C. So is that worthwhile, and how do we do it?
That's an easy one.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Yeah, so the background on this is it was a political decision based on a BRAC decision and what's called MHA, rules and restrictions in Washington, and the need to reduce headquarters staff in Washington, in the National Capital Region. So when the Navy made a decision on reducing its footprint, we had also simultaneously closed down aviation A schools in Millington, Tennessee. And the political forces that were in place at the time said, well, okay, you can move that A school, but you're going to replace it with something. And of course, you know, the natural, easy fit was to take the vast majority of what BUPERS, NPC, and PERS 6, PERS 2, all of those, that workforce, and shift it to Millington. Infrastructure and all those things that go with it were there. Could we reverse it or change it to a fleet concentration area? I guess the answer would be yes. But we would have to have the political will to shut down Millington altogether, shut down that base, and that becomes a decision well above uniform pay grade. And I think that would be a real impediment to making that shift. That said, it's also, I would be concerned with another big change to an organization that's already in the throes of change. And it's probably something to visit down the road as more and more pressure comes on our headquarters staff at many different levels. So we're no longer just talking about the Washington, D.C. area. We're talking about headquarters staffs in the fleet and joint commands, combatant commands, all those sorts of things. So we eventually may have to do that, and that would be one place to look at. That said, you know, have you ever worked there? Would you like to go there? Because we could use your talent.
I think we know.
Yeah. No, I mean, people go there. It's like people who are told, hey, they're no kidding. You're getting orders to Hawaii, and you're a family, and everybody goes, no, don't want that. I hear bad things about the schools. You're going to Japan. Oh, I don't want to go overseas. I don't want to go to Japan. And then when they get there, they're just as stubborn about leaving. A lot can be said about folks that go to Millington in that respect. It's a great family environment. It's affordable housing, affordable cost of living, but it is removed from the fleet, and that's unfortunate. So the way to get it more closely tied to the fleet is through some systems that allow the transparency that the fleet does not perceive exists today between their detailer and opportunities for jobs in the future. We have to build that. It does not exist today in the officer communities. We're getting much better in the enlisted communities, but we've got a ways to go on the officer front. Thanks, Roger.
Jay Donnelly.
Yep.
Admiral, you showed a curve. Good to see you, sir. You showed a curve that illustrated the upward trend of cost per sailor and said we're going to try to get after that, yet many of the initiatives that we've read about, vested retirement plan with government matching, 24 weeks of maternity leave, and several other initiatives tend to push that curve even higher, I would think. What initiatives would change the slope on that curve?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. For those of you who lived in the 70s, hopefully you'll appreciate this analogy. I can't help it because when I was a midshipman, the thing to do as a senior as a midshipman, other than buy a car, was to get a great stereo system with the biggest speakers and the most amperage and all that kind of stuff. Remember those things called equalizers? Do they still exist today? I don't know. It's all digital. No, they don't exist. Okay. But an equalizer had it on it one big knob called the volume knob, and then a whole bunch of little knobs or switches that if you could adjust to improve the quality of the sound coming out of those big speakers you bought. If you think of the volume knob as the pay and compensation knob, you only have to move that a little bit to get a lot of bang for your buck. The only people that have their hands on that volume knob are not me. Okay, so I can't do anything about pay raises and some of the other things that are cut across all the services. And you move them a little bit, 0.5% increase or decrease in pay across the force is billions of dollars. The things we're talking about doing are tens of millions of dollars. They're in the, way down here, but they improve the quality of the force. They're designed to not just go after numbers. It can't be about quantity alone. It has to be about the quality. So if I'm able to move these things around and improve the quality of the sound, the quality of our people that stay in the Navy, we're going to have a much better stereo system at the end of the day. And the volume will move up and down depending on forces we can't control. So that's fundamentally it. These are not high expense cost drivers. And by the way, most of them we're doing in piloted efforts to see if we do get the return, to see if these young men and women do say, I'm committed, I'm loyal to the company that allowed me to go do this, and there's a return on that investment and improve that quality. If we start to see those, like we are in CIP Career and Mission Program, and others that we're doing with grad ed, tours with industry, and if things like maternity leave going to 18 weeks turns into a higher retention rate on women, it pays for itself overnight. So we got to give some run time to the little moves. That's why I say we can worry about DAMA and wring our hands over DAMA and Goldwater Nichols and say, God, we should have done something right now to that without a real good understanding of what that means. Or we can, in the meantime, while that happens, in the meantime, do some things over here with the smaller levers that give us discretion to deal with populations of the Navy that we really need to go after. And as that runtime's going, it informs our discussion about DAMA, it informs our discussion about Goldwater Nichols, it informs our discussion about retirement programs, and I think that's why we're underway on messing around with these levers and not the volume knob. Sorry to be so simple about it. That's the only way I can
lieutenant there in the fourth row.
Good morning, sir. Lieutenant Maggie Morton. I have a question, or two questions actually, that pertain to identifying top talent. And the first is in regards to the fitness reporting system. Earlier this year, in May, we released a new fit rep instruction. And my question is, it relates with it has a focus on command climate, and also you called for fitness reports to be more honest. And that would obviously help you identify who your top talent is and also who we don't want. So my question is, have you been able to measure that that's actually being implemented in the fleet? And my second question is, we also recently implemented a 360-degree feedback system, but it doesn't go into your official record.
Yeah.
So when we go to promotion and command boards, no one's seeing that feedback. So is there a plan, or do you think that should be a part of that system?
Yeah, great question. And CNO, you'll see when he completely unveils the design for maintaining maritime superiority. It is he's already challenged me and tasked me with going to look at what's in our performance evaluations. Are we measuring the right things, and then are we measuring them in the right way? And I think the task alone implies that probably not. And so what have we learned from the last year or two since changing the fit rep instruction? Probably too early to tell on that front, but when we talk about character and integrity and 360 feedback, how do you plug that in so that the boards are better informed by the potential for great leadership at multiple levels? So we're standing up a working group. We're inviting, as you are aware, junior officers and sailors to participate in that, to Mitzi's point, ask the hard questions, have the dialogue with junior and senior sailors across the force, and not just be a dictum from the top down. And I think we'll get to a better place. I personally have concerns about the 360 evaluations because A, it's very expensive, and B, it's only as good as you implement it. Are you asking the right people for the feedback, and then how do you protect that from retaliation and other forms that we're all familiar with? So all of that's part of the discussion that we'll take on in that group.
I think we only have time for one more question. This gentleman here has had his hand raised.
Admiral, Brad Henderson with Defense One. You mentioned an imminent working group on Goldwater Nichols changes reform. Yeah. What kinds of stuff are you going to be looking at?
Well, so it came out this morning in the press. We knew it was going to lead to that. Initially, the working group that has been focused lately just on DAMA was going to look, I believe we started that conversation with all statutory regulations with regard to personnel management, and then the animal became so big that we just focused on DAMA this time. And now we're going to move to the next level, largely because Senator McCain and the Senate, the staff, the SASC, has said, hey, we're going to debate this year. It's on our agenda, and we are going to ask the services for their input. So I think OSD has taken a lead on this and has formed this working group. I'm not exactly sure when we're going to kick it off, but it's within days or weeks. So we'll have a very similar kind of debate that we had with the DAMA reform, and try to get at the right things that make our heads hurt in terms of the requirements underneath Goldwater Nichols, which were implemented in 1986. You could argue certain aspects of that have driven us to a place where I don't think the law intended to be. So we need to challenge that and see if we can make adjustments to that. There's a lot of goodness in Goldwater Nichols, but there's also some things that have drifted in a direction that we think need to be adjusted. So that'll be a big part of the discussion.
Can you elaborate?
Well, I mean, there is a theory that our combatant command staffs have grown to support the requirement to promote inside of joint regulations under Goldwater Nichols. I'm not sure that's true, but we need to get all the services together. We need to show the data, get at the truth, and then decide what recommendations or adjustments we need to make. So that's one aspect of it. Certainly, as we look at specialty career paths, which is a better way to employ really good talent that wants to stay but doesn't have another path to stay, it may not at all involve jointness as a requirement. And so we're going to certainly look at those specialty career paths and other things. But those two laws, statutes, are on the officer side. Thankfully, we don't have the same very constraining laws and regulations on the enlisted side other than end strength regulations. So we're a little bit more flexible in what we can do with the enlisted force. Thanks for the question.
This is the last in our 2015 series, this partnership between CSIS and the Naval Institute, which has gone through the year. It's been successful. We're going to do it again in 2016. We want to thank our sponsor for 2015, Lockheed Martin, without whose support this would not have been possible. But most importantly, we want to thank our speaker today for coming out, the Chief of Naval Personnel, Admiral Bill Moran. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you. Thank you.